Here's a question we've all probably asked ourselves at some point. Why do some people succeed, sometimes wildly, while others just don't? It's a huge question. Today, we're going to dig into a really thought-provoking way to look at it, using the framework from Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities. Think about this for a second. Let's look at the world of professional golf. We're talking about the best of the best, right? Well, according to the source material, over 80% of them, more than 80%, have never won a single PGA tournament in their entire careers. You've got a handful of superstars who seem to win everything, and then the vast majority who never even get close. And that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Why are the results, the achievements, so incredibly unequal? Not just in sports, but everywhere you look in society. Is something unfair going on, or is there something else at play that we're maybe not seeing? Now, usually, when we see these massive gaps, the conversation pretty quickly lands on one of two things. It's gotta be genetics, or it's gotta be discrimination. But the argument we're going to explore today says that by focusing on only those two explanations, we might be missing the real story entirely. Okay, let's dive into the core argument of the book. It all revolves around this central idea of prerequisites. So what are prerequisites? Well, think of them as the absolute must-haves, the non-negotiable things you need to succeed at something. And here's the critical insight. It's not about having most of them. The book argues that you often need to have all of them at the same time, or the whole thing just falls apart. And this is that all-or-nothing idea in action. Look, you can have prerequisite A, maybe you're really smart, and you can have prerequisite B, you've got an incredible work ethic. But if you're missing prerequisite C, let's say it's something as basic as being able to read, the outcome isn't just a little bit worse, it's often total failure. This, the book argues, is why we see such wildly skewed results so often, instead of a nice, neat bell curve. And this idea plays out in some really surprising places, even inside the same family. Get this, a study of National Merit Scholarship finalists found that in families with 5 kids, the firstborn child was the finalist more often than the other 4 siblings combined. We're talking a ratio of more than 4-to-1. And this isn't just some fluke. The source points to study after study from all over the world, showing that firstborns tend to have, on average, higher IQs, get more education, and even earn more money. So here's the big point. If outcomes aren't even equal for kids raised by the same parents, in the same house, why on earth would we expect them to be perfectly equal across a whole society? This whole prerequisite model doesn't just apply to families, it scales up to entire nations. The book points to Scotland in the 18th century. It was a poor country, but it added one prerequisite, widespread literacy, and became an intellectual powerhouse. Or think about Japan in the 19th century, which went from being isolated to a global leader just by adding the prerequisite of Western technology. And then you have the flip side. 15th century China, which was way ahead, gave up the prerequisite of being open to the outside world and went into a long decline. It shows how one single missing piece can change everything. It all kind of leads to this one simple but powerful idea, which historian David Landes put perfectly. The world has never been a level playing field. The argument is that these uneven starting points, whether they're because of geography, culture, or history, they're just the historical norm, not some weird exception. Okay, so keeping that whole prerequisite framework in mind, let's move on. The book uses it to offer a really different way of looking at discrimination itself. It starts by basically splitting the word into 2 separate ideas. Okay, so on one side, you have what the book calls Discrimination I. This is just making distinctions based on facts. A fire department needing firefighters who can carry heavy equipment. It's about discerning real differences. But then you have Discrimination II, and this is what we usually mean when we say the word. It's arbitrary bias, treating people badly just for the group they belong to. And it's the second type that all the anti-discrimination laws are meant to combat. Now, here's where things get a really interesting economic twist. The book argues that practicing that second kind of discrimination, Discrimination II, isn't free. There's often a very real cost to the person doing the discriminating, and that cost can dramatically change how people actually behave. And the example they use for this is a powerful one, apartheid South Africa. Discrimination was literally the law of the land. And yet, the book points out that in competitive industries, white employers would often break the law to hire more black workers than they were allowed to. So why? Well, the argument is that for them, the economic cost of passing up a good worker and losing profit was higher than the cost of paying the fine. For them, raw bias was just bad for business. But the politicians who wrote those laws, they paid zero economic price for their discrimination. All right, on to our final section, which is all about numbers and how they can be used. This gets into a huge warning from the book about how data can fool us, even when the numbers themselves are 100% accurate. So let's look at this chart. It's from a US government report back in 2000 on mortgage applications. As you can see, the rejection rate for Black applicants was literally double the rate for white applicants. I mean, at first glance, the conclusion seems pretty obvious, right? But watch what happens when we add one more bar with data from the very same report. The rejection rate for Asian American applicants was almost half the rate for whites. Now suddenly, the story is way more complicated. Does this mean the bankers were discriminating against their own group in favor of Asian Americans? It doesn't seem to make sense. This is what the book calls an error of omission. It's not that the numbers are wrong. The numbers are perfectly correct. But by leaving out a crucial piece of the puzzle, like the data on other groups or maybe other factors like credit scores, you end up with a picture that is completely and totally misleading. Here's one more example from the source, this time looking at policy. Back in 1948, when there wasn't really an effective national minimum wage, unemployment for Black and white male teens was very low and almost exactly the same. But then, starting in the 1950s, as those laws became more widespread, a huge gap opened up, a gap that's been there ever since. The book poses the tough question. Is it possible that a policy intended to help actually ended up creating a disparity by pricing the least experienced workers out of a job? So after all that, where does this leave us? While the source material isn't really trying to offer some simple, one-size-fits-all solution, what it's really doing is giving us a completely different framework, a different set of tools for thinking about these really complex and sensitive issues. So let's just recap the big ideas we've covered from the book. First, that huge unequal outcomes are actually pretty normal throughout history and even in nature. Second, that success is often an all-or-nothing game. You need all the prerequisites. Because of that, just seeing a disparity doesn't automatically mean discrimination is the cause. We also saw how the cost of bias can actually hold it in check. And maybe most importantly, that statistics, without the full context, can lead us way, way off track. And all of this leads to the book's final and maybe most challenging question for us to think about. If all the things required for success, the prerequisites, are never distributed equally to begin with, then what if the goal of achieving perfectly equal outcomes is at odds with how the world actually works? That wraps up our explainer on this really challenging framework. Thanks so much for joining us. Today's explainer was based on the arguments presented in the book Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell.